They say genius is rare, but no one tells you it's lonely, that it isolates you, haunts you, turns your mind into both a weapon and a prison. John Nash wasn't just intelligent, he was terrifyingly brilliant. The kind of mind that could model entire economies in his head. The kind of mind that could see what no one else could. And eventually that became the problem. Because he didn't just see numbers. He saw codes and newspaper headlines. Secret agents watching from rooftops. A friend who never existed. He saw worlds no one else could find and couldn't escape them. He was a young man with the world at his feet. A math prodigy at Princeton. Arrogant, solitary, obsessed with creating a truly original idea. But as the world began to recognize his brilliance, something else began to stir. A second voice. A shadow. A fracture. Nash's mind, once razor-sharp, began to splinter. Hallucinations. Paranoia. A descent into schizophrenia so severe it cost him nearly everything. His career, his credibility, his freedom. But here's what they don't tell you about madness. This isn't a tragedy, this is a resurrection. Because against all odds, Nash returned. Not by conquering his illness, but by outthinking it. He learned to ignore the voices. He chose not to indulge the delusion. And with time, with love, and with the quiet persistence of his spirit, he earned back the one thing he had always chased: clarity. This is not just the story of a mathematician. It's a story about the price of brilliance, the pain of the mind, and the quiet, unshakable power of choosing to return from the edge. It's a story for anyone who's ever questioned their own reality, who's ever fought a battle no one else could see. And most of all, it's a story that proves this genius isn't the ability to see what others can't. It's the courage to keep going when you no longer trust what you see. Have you ever felt like your gift was also your curse? Comment yes if this hits home. Chapter 1: The Quiet Boy in Bluefield. He wasn't born a genius. He was born invisible. John Forbes Nash Jr. came into the world on June 13, 1928, in the small, quiet town of Bluefield, West Virginia, a place where dreams rarely stretch past the county line. From the start, Nash didn't quite fit. He wasn't warm. He wasn't social. While other children played outside, Nash stayed inside, dismantling radios, solving puzzles far beyond his age, and obsessing over patterns no one else noticed. His father, a gentle electrical engineer, nurtured this fascination with science. His mother, a school teacher, pushed him academically. But even they couldn't understand the strange inner world their son inhabited. Teachers described him as odd and withdrawn. He avoided eye contact, spoke only when necessary, and seemed forever lost in a thought that was just out of reach. Here's the funny part. When he was 12, Nash entered a math competition and lost. Why? Because he solved the problem using a method so advanced the judges didn't understand it. They marked it wrong. Even as a child, he was already thinking beyond the system. In a world that demanded conformity, Nash responded with silence. But that silence wasn't emptiness, it was calculation. By the time he was a teenager, Nash was studying advanced calculus, building elaborate experiments in his garage, and submitting math problems to national competitions. But even then, there was a loneliness in his brilliance. He didn't just want to solve equations, he wanted to prove something. That he mattered. That he wasn't just strange or broken or isolated. That he was necessary. But in Bluefield, genius was a rumor, a dangerous, almost laughable ambition. He was the boy with no friends and no place to put his mind except on paper. And so, he wrote. He sketched complex theories in notebooks, he invented games, he memorized equations like poetry. He withdrew further until the only conversation that felt real was the one happening in his head. Have you ever felt like the way you see the world makes you unrelatable? Like your thoughts are too sharp, too fast, too strange to be shared? That was John Nash. And yet beneath the stillness something pulsed, an unspoken conviction that one day he would be undeniable. Not because he was liked, not because he was understood, but because the world would have no choice but to see him. But Princeton was about to witness something no textbook could predict. Chapter 2: Outsider Among Geniuses. Princeton, 1948. A sanctuary for brilliance. The air practically buzzed with ideas, game theory, quantum mechanics, abstract algebra. It was the kind of place where Nobel laureates discussed the future of the universe over coffee. And into this sacred intellectual temple walked John Forbes Nash Jr., unapologetically strange, dazzlingly intelligent, and completely uninterested in playing by anyone's rules. He arrived not as a student hungry to learn, but as a mind obsessed with being original. While others attended lectures, Nash dismissed them outright. He claimed they were a waste of time. Professors found him arrogant. Classmates found him unbearable. But Nash didn't care. He didn't come to Princeton to be liked. He came to become immortal. Classes will dull your mind, destroy the potential for authentic creativity, he declared. And here's the kicker. He actually convinced the administration to let him skip most of them. At 20 years old, he was already negotiating his own terms with one of the world's most prestigious universities. He spent most of his time alone, scribbling on blackboards, writing equations on window panes, wandering the campus with a distant look in his eyes. His dorm room was a mess of notebooks, coffee cups, and half-solved theories. He rarely spoke unless it was about mathematics. Eye contact was a negotiation, empathy an abstraction. One day, a fellow student found Nash standing in the common room at 3 a.m., staring at a hexagonal tile pattern on the floor. "What are you doing?" the student asked. Nash didn't look up. "I'm developing a new board game based on territorial control. I call it Nash. Want to play?" The game later became commercially marketed as Hex, and yet beneath the cold surface was an engine running at impossible speed. Nash wasn't just thinking. He was hunting. He believed that in order to be great, you had to do what no one else had done. Not just solve problems, invent them. At night, he walked the corridors like a ghost, murmuring formulas to himself. He became a campus mystery. People whispered, "Who is that guy? Why doesn't he speak?" But inside Nash's mind, something extraordinary was building. An idea that would change the way the world understood competition, negotiation, and the very concept of decision-making. But here's what genius looks like when it strikes. Not in a library, not in a classroom, but in the messiest place of all real life. Chapter 3, The Blonde in the Bar. It was supposed to be an ordinary night. A group of Princeton students, half drunk and fully competitive, were sitting at a smoky bar near campus when she walked in. A stunning blonde, the kind of woman who instantly rearranges the gravitational field of a room. Every man at the table turned to look, and like soldiers deploying without a plan, they each began plotting how to approach her first. Compliments, jokes, bravado, the same tired strategies. But Nash didn't move. He just watched. And then suddenly he saw it. Not the girl, but the system. "If we all go for the blonde," he muttered, eyes narrowing, "we block each other. No one wins. But if each of us ignores the blonde and goes for her friends, we don't get in each other's way. Everyone wins. That's the only way to maximize payoff for the individual and the group." His friends laughed. "Nash, are you seriously turning pickup strategy into math?" But Nash wasn't joking. In that dim bar, amid beer and banter, he glimpsed what economists, politicians, and generals had missed for centuries, that the best outcome isn't when each person does what's best for themselves, but when each does what's best for themselves and the group. He rushed back to campus, still slightly drunk, and formalized it. The idea became what we now call the Nash equilibrium, a fundamental breakthrough in game theory. It challenged the dominant thinking of the time. It transformed how we understand competition, strategy, even war. And it made Nash, at just 21 years old, a rising star in mathematics. But with every spark of glory came a shadow of detachment. His ego swelled. Recognition poured in, but connection still eluded him. He could model global behavior, but couldn't hold a conversation without wandering off mid-sentence. To him, feelings were variables. People were probabilities. Intimacy was unquantifiable noise. He wasn't just brilliant, he was unreachable. Still, the academic world now had no choice but to see him. Journals cited him. Professors watched him closely. But Nash didn't care about applause. He only wanted the next problem, the deeper puzzle, the bigger idea. And yet, Something else was stirring inside him. A quiet rustle beneath the theorems, a glitch in the matrix of his mind, a presence he couldn't explain. He began to sense messages in newspapers, codes hidden in red ink, movements in the shadows, because just as his mind had once discovered a new order, it was now starting to unravel into chaos. Chapter 4. The Secret Agent Illusion. It started with a letter. No stamp, no return address, just a message that felt special, chosen. Inside was an invitation, cryptic, urgent, seemingly from the Department of Defense. It told him he'd been selected, that his genius was needed, that he alone could stop a Soviet plot buried inside everyday communications. At first, Nash hesitated, but the seduction of purpose was too strong. After all, hadn't he spent his entire life waiting for someone to finally see him? From that moment on, the line between brilliance and delusion dissolved. He began to see codes in newspapers, sequences only he could recognize. Random words weren't random anymore. They were messages. He spent hours reading between the lines, highlighting, decoding, reporting. He believed a vast Cold War conspiracy was unfolding, and he was the key. In his mind, this wasn't madness. It was logic, a new layer of reality. The government had built a secret communication system, and he had been recruited to crack it. He worked in secret, slipping envelopes of his findings into mailboxes marked with invisible signs. He scanned license plates, tracked strangers with navy coats and mirrored sunglasses. Shadows became suspects, radios became transmitters, and slowly, paranoia became home. One night, his landlady found him in the hallway at 2 a.m., pressing his ear against the wall. "Dr. Nash, what are you doing?" she asked. He turned to her, eyes wild. "They're transmitting through the electrical wiring. Can't you hear it? 60 hertz. It's Morse code." She backed away slowly. "Have you ever believed something so deeply that even your breath aligned with its rhythm?" That was Nash, and to anyone watching from the outside, it was terrifying. His once calculated demeanor became erratic. He spoke in fragments. His eyes darted as if tracking things no one else could see. He refused to bathe, convinced the government had tapped the plumbing. He stopped making sense, but in his mind everything made perfect sense. He didn't question the logic because it was logical, just to the wrong reality. Let's pause here. We've watched Nash rise from an isolated boy to a Princeton revolutionary to a man seeing codes in newspapers. The descent has begun, but sometimes in our darkest spirals, love finds a way to anchor us. Sometimes one person's faith can pull us back from the edge. Yet love couldn't protect him from the cruelest betrayal, his own mind creating the very connections he craved. Chapter 5. Alicia. She wasn't part of his equations. She wasn't in his proof. And yet, Alicia Lard stepped into John Nash's life like a soft breeze through a sealed room. She was a student in one of his classes at MIT, brilliant in her own right, studying physics, but more than that, she was warm, grounded, and startlingly real. Where Nash saw systems and signs, Alicia saw him. Not the myth, not the math, the man. At first, he didn't know what to do with her attention. It confused him, threw off his internal balance. He tried to ignore it, brush it aside like an unsolvable variable. But Alicia didn't flinch. She asked him real questions. She made him laugh, an awkward, unused muscle in his face. And when he stumbled in conversation, she didn't look away. She waited. Their courtship was uniquely Nash. He once approached her after class and said, "I find you attractive. Your survival instincts are strong, your skeletal structure is appealing, and your IQ is sufficient for our children." She laughed. "Is that your idea of a compliment?" He blinked. "It's a statistical assessment." Their relationship was strange, asymmetrical. Nash wasn't romantic, he wasn't tender. Another time he gave her a rose and said plainly, "This is a token of affection. Statistically, it increases mating likelihood by 17%. But Alicia didn't leave. She saw past the logic. She saw the loneliness. They married in 1957. And for a brief time, Nash became something like whole. He worked, he taught, he held her hand during lectures. She grounded him, reminded him of what was real. But the shadows weren't done with him yet. Shortly after their wedding, the hallucinations returned with ferocity. Charles reappeared, his imaginary college roommate charming as ever. So did William Parcher, the government agent feeding Nash orders in whispers and riddles. Alicia noticed the change. The whispered conversations behind closed doors, the sudden outbursts, the pages of numbers covering their walls. She asked questions. He deflected. She searched his desk, and what she found terrified her. Dozens of sealed envelopes, all addressed to non-existent CIA contacts, all filled with frantic codes and clippings. One night, Alicia followed him. He was standing in the rain, staring at a mailbox as if waiting for it to speak. She called his name. He didn't hear her, just kept murmuring numbers under his breath. That's when she knew the man she married wasn't just brilliant. He was unwell. Still, she didn't leave, and that choice might be the most heroic act in the entire story. Because loving a genius is hard, but loving a mind unraveling, loving a man who can no longer tell what's real, is a different kind of strength altogether. Have you ever stood beside someone whose world was falling apart? Type stayed if you know this kind of love. Chapter 6. Charles. Charles was funny, loyal, the only one who seemed to truly understand Nash without judgment. He'd been there from the early Princeton days, offering casual wisdom, pushing Nash to enjoy life beyond numbers. He made him laugh when nothing else could. He gave him advice when no one else would. He was the brother Nash never had, the friend who never left. But there was one problem. Charles wasn't real. For years, Nash had held conversations with him, taken walks with him, even introduced him to Alicia, though she never actually saw anyone there. At first, she thought it was metaphor, a joke. But over time, Charles became a looming presence in their lives. He appeared in Nash's stories, his decisions, his arguments. Nash didn't just see Charles. He trusted him more than anyone else. Here's the heartbreaking detail: Charles even helped Nash with his work sometimes. Nash would be stuck on a problem and Charles would casually suggest an approach. "Why don't you try it backwards?" Charles would say, feet up on the desk, smoking an imaginary cigarette. And it would work. How do you let go of someone who helps you think? Charles had a niece, a quiet little girl named Marseille. She appeared too, playful, wide-eyed, innocent. Nash adored her, spoke to her gently, laughed with her, protected her. But even she wasn't real. She never aged, never changed, never blinked. It took years for Nash to notice that. But Alicia saw it sooner, and her heart broke a little more every time. You see, delusions aren't always terrifying. Sometimes they come wrapped in comfort, in connection. Charles wasn't a demon. He was companionship, the part of Nash that craved warmth, friendship, family. His mind, in its loneliness, had invented a lifeline, and that's what made it so hard to let go. Imagine being told your best friend isn't real, that the person who kept you company through your darkest years was a figment. Imagine the grief, the betrayal, the fear. That was Nash's reality. And Charles, this hallucination so deeply embedded in his psyche, wasn't evil. He didn't want to hurt Nash, but he had to be let go. It came slowly, painfully. A realization that something didn't add up. Marcy hadn't aged in over a decade. Charles never changed clothes. The pieces began to fracture. And with Alicia's quiet insistence, Nash began to question the one thing he'd always trusted: his own mind. That was the beginning of the break. Not a dramatic shattering, but a slow, terrifying unraveling. The fortress of intellect he'd built around himself began to show cracks. And through them came a single, blinding truth. What if none of it was real? But then came the moment that changed everything, when imagination nearly cost a life. The house was silent, the kind of silence that feels wrong. Alicia stepped into the kitchen calling Nash's name, but there was no response. A pot boiled over on the stove. Papers covered the counters. Codes, formulas, scribbled nonsense. And then she heard it. Water, running, from the bathroom. She pushed open the door. The bathtub was full, still. Their infant son floating quietly just inches below disaster. Alone, unattended. Nash stood nearby, completely calm, unmoved, his gaze distant, locked on a figure Alicia could not see. "I thought Charles was watching him," he said. That sentence cracked her in two. There was no Charles. There never had been. But to Nash, Charles was real enough to entrust his child's life to. That was the moment Alicia realized this wasn't just eccentricity. It wasn't genius gone too far. It was dangerous. It was spiraling beyond control. And it was going to destroy all of them if she didn't act. She pulled the baby from the water, checked his breathing, held him close. Then she made the call. Doctors, psychiatrists, an ambulance. When they came for him, Nash didn't fight. Not at first. But the confusion in his eyes was unbearable. Betrayal. Panic. He didn't understand why the people around him were turning into enemies. He shouted about spies, secret organizations, that they were trying to silence him. He kicked, he screamed, he begged. Alicia stood frozen as they sedated him. Then came the hospital, the diagnoses, the words paranoid schizophrenia, words too heavy to process. Treatments followed, antipsychotics that left him blank and trembling, electroconvulsive therapy that wiped fragments of memory like chalk from a blackboard, insulin shock treatments that made him convulse for hours. The man who once dazzled the world with his mind now sat vacant in a chair, drooling, afraid to speak. But Alicia stayed. She visited. She held his hand. She spoke to him even when he didn't answer. Friends told her to leave. Family begged her to walk away. "He's never coming back," they said. "Save yourself." But she couldn't. Because somewhere behind that vacant stare was the man who once told her that love was the only equation he couldn't solve. Stop and think, would you have stayed? Be honest with yourself. It's heavy, I know. Watching brilliance crumble, watching love tested beyond reason. But here's what the doctors didn't understand. Sometimes the mind finds its own way back. Not through force, not through drugs, but through something quieter. Something that looks like surrender but is actually strength. Chapter 8. The Ghost at Princeton. He came back quietly. No press. No welcome, no grand return. Just a man slightly stooped, eyes still guarded, walking slowly through the same stone corridors where he had once reigned as a rising star. But now, he was a ghost. John Nash returned to Princeton in the 1970s not as a professor, not even as a student, but as a silent presence. He wandered the campus like a shadow of his former self. He had no salary, no title, no official role. Just a table in the library, a chalkboard in a corner, and a battered notebook he carried everywhere. To most students, he was simply that strange old man. Some called him the Phantom of Fine Hall. They didn't know his name, didn't know that this was the same man who had once reinvented the rules of strategy. They saw only the disheveled clothes, the muttered conversations with no one, the gaze that seemed to focus on things no one else could see. But then something funny happened. Students started noticing the equations he left on blackboards. One morning, a professor walked into his classroom to find a proof so elegant, so unexpected, that he spent the entire lecture trying to understand it. "Who wrote this?" he asked. A student in the back raised his hand. "The Phantom did." Nash was doing something that no one noticed at first. He was returning, not in a flash, not all at once. Slowly, deliberately, painfully. He stopped fighting the hallucinations and instead began to ignore them. Not because they weren't there, but because he chose not to engage. "I still see things that aren't there," he once admitted to a curious graduate student, "but I've developed the ability to not listen, like a diet of the mind." And that simple sentence was a revolution. He wasn't cured. He wasn't fixed. He had learned to live above the noise, to separate the real from the imagined. Not through medication, but through will, through mathematics, through self-awareness so fierce it became armor. He began sitting in on seminars, scribbling notes, sometimes whispering insights to confused professors who would later realize he was right. The man they thought was irrelevant had solved problems still unsolved. But he never demanded credit. He never argued. He simply existed. Can you imagine returning to the place of your greatest humiliation and quietly rebuilding one equation at a time. That takes a different kind of genius. But what he did next shocked the medical community. Chapter 9, Refusing the Medication. They told him he'd never get better without pills. That schizophrenia was a lifelong sentence, manageable only with medication. But Nash made a decision few could understand, and even fewer dared to take. He stopped the treatment. No more sedatives, no more electroshocks, no more fog clouding the edges of his thoughts. It was risky. Reckless, some said. But for Nash, it was necessary. The drugs dulled his demons, yes, but they also dulled his genius. The equations didn't flow. The clarity didn't come. He felt like a shadow of a man. So he chose to face the voices without a chemical wall. Not to fight them, but to live beside them. It's like a diet, he explained to a stunned psychiatrist. I simply chose not to indulge certain appetites. The voices are still there. I just don't give them my attention anymore. The doctor was speechless. This wasn't how schizophrenia worked. You couldn't just ignore it. But Nash was doing exactly that. He began to recognize the patterns, the rhythm of the hallucinations. He knew when Charles would arrive, when William Parcher's whisper would slither into his ear, but he no longer responded. He didn't argue, didn't scream. He simply turned away. It wasn't denial, it was discipline. He developed rules. If a person didn't age over years, they weren't real. If no one else acknowledged them, they were suspect. If they only appeared when he was alone, he would not engage. Simple, logical, brutal. Have you ever had to create your own rules for reality? Comment my rules if you understand this level of self-awareness. He once explained to a colleague, I reasoned that if I'm seeing things that others don't, then maybe it's best not to mention them. Maybe I can quietly ignore them and focus on what's real. And it worked, slowly, brutally, brilliantly. He didn't just survive. He began to rebuild. His mind, once fractured by fantasy, found structure again in numbers. He solved problems, attended conferences, published papers. He sat among the same peers who once pitied him, now speaking softly, lucidly, with flashes of the same old brilliance. Except now it was tempered, grounded, aware. And perhaps most astonishing of all, he did it with full awareness that the illness never left. It was still there. The voices never disappeared. But he had outgrown their power, not by silencing them, but by not believing them. Think about that for a second. He didn't wait to be cured to contribute. He didn't need to be normal to be valuable. He just needed to show up, equation by equation, day by day. And slowly the world began to notice. Chapter 10. The Return of the Mind. It began like a whisper, barely noticed, easily dismissed. A correction offered at the back of a crowded seminar. A quiet proof written in the margins of a problem left unsolved. John Nash, the ghost mathematician, was stirring. He started attending lectures, not as a speaker, not as a professor, but as an anonymous observer. He sat silently in the corners of classrooms where younger minds struggled with the same puzzles he once devoured. And when asked a question, gently, humbly, he would answer with terrifying precision. Not arrogance, not showmanship, just truth. Whispers grew. That's Nash? You mean the Nash? I thought he was gone. A group of graduate students stayed behind after a seminar on advanced game theory. A complex economic theorem had just been presented. The room buzzed with confusion. Nash approached the board, said nothing for a full minute. Then with trembling hands, he picked up a piece of chalk. The room went silent. Someone started recording. No grand speech, no announcement, just numbers, arrows. Silence. Until a gasp cut the air. He had not only solved it, he had simplified it to something a child could understand. Where others saw complexity, Nash saw patterns. Where they saw chaos, he found order. The room stood still. Time seemed to fold in on itself. For a moment, everyone in that room wasn't looking at a ghost. They were looking at a giant. The video spread through the math department, then MIT, then Harvard. Nash is back, they whispered. Not the tragic figure, not the cautionary tale, the mind. That scene repeated itself again and again, in classrooms, in hallways, in journals. His work began to circulate, not because he published it, but because others began to notice his name scribbled in the corners of notebooks, next to elegant equations no one else could finish. One professor admitted, "I gave my class a problem I'd been working on for 6 months. Nash solved it during the coffee break, on a napkin, then threw the napkin away because he said it was trivial. When was the last time you proved your worth not with words but with quiet action? That's the real comeback." His reputation was rebuilding itself not through noise but through necessity. Because sometimes the world doesn't need you to explain your return, it just needs your return to be undeniable. And then came the gesture that changed everything. Chapter 11, the pen ceremony. It happened without announcement. No trumpet, no headlines. Just a long oak table in a quiet Princeton hall. A room full of professors. Some gray-haired, others once young men who remembered the strange genius that used to haunt the back of their seminars. John Nash entered, unsure why he'd been called. He sat still and silent. And then, one by one, his peers began to rise. Each walked slowly toward the table and placed a pen before him. No words, no ceremony, just the unmistakable gesture of reverence that, at Princeton, meant one thing. We honor you. We recognize you. You belong. The first pen clicked against the wood, then another and another. The sound was almost musical. Nash's hands began to tremble. It was a tradition reserved only for the greatest scholars, the ones who shaped the world with their minds. Nash, stunned, looked down at the growing pile. His hands trembled, not because he had longed for this moment, but because he had long stopped believing it would ever come. By the 20th pen, tears pooled in his eyes. He didn't wipe them. A young professor, too young to have known Nash in his prime, was the last to approach. He placed his pen down gently and whispered, "Thank you for showing us that coming back is possible." The boy from Bluefield, who once scribbled equations on windows, who vanished into madness, who returned like a ghost to walk among the living, was now being honored not for surviving, but for transforming. Imagine walking into the very institution that once whispered about your breakdown, and being met with bowed heads, not pity, with silence, not shame, with respect, not regret. Nash didn't weep. He didn't speak. He simply nodded once, as if to say, "I'm here and I'm ready." That room held more than respect. It held redemption, proof that the world can recognize value even after it's been lost, even after it's been buried, even after everyone, including you, stopped believing it was there. And if Princeton could see it, what else was possible? The answer would come from Stockholm. Chapter 12. Nobel Prize. It came wrapped in disbelief. October 1994. Whispers turned to headlines. John Nash wins the Nobel Prize in economics. The world paused. Could it be true? The man who'd vanished into psychiatric hospitals, now celebrated by the highest academic honor on earth? The debate ignited instantly. Nobel committees had never given the award to someone with a known mental illness, especially not schizophrenia. Some argued it would damage the credibility of the prize. Others said it was long overdue, because Nash's work on non-cooperative game theory, the Nash equilibrium, had already revolutionized everything from market dynamics to evolutionary biology to nuclear strategy. Here's what most people don't know. Nash almost didn't accept it. He was terrified of the spotlight, of the questions, of the pressure. Alicia had to convince him. "This isn't just for you," she said. "It's for everyone who's been told their mind is too broken to matter." Nash stood at the podium in Stockholm, December 10th, 1994. Alicia beside him. She held his hand, not as a wife in a photo op, but as the woman who stayed when no one else did. The woman who walked with him through delusion, silence, shame, and snow. The applause thundered, cameras flashed. But Nash looked down, modest, grounded, present. When he finally spoke, the room held its breath. "I've always believed in numbers," he said quietly, "in the equations and logic that lead to reason. But after a lifetime of such pursuit, I ask, what truly is logic? Who decides reason? My quest has taken me through the physical, the metaphysical, the delusional, and back. And I have made the most important discovery of my career, the most important of my life. It is only in the mysterious equations of love that any logic or reason can be found. The room didn't just applaud. It exhaled. Because this wasn't just a man who'd recovered. This was a man who had transcended, who had woven together madness and intellect, pain and purpose, love and mathematics into something no one could deny. He didn't thank the committee, he thanked Alicia. He looked at her and said, "You are the reason I am. You are all my reasons." "Who's your Alicia?" "Tag them. Tell them. Don't wait." But life had one more chapter to write. Chapter 13. The Taxi. May 23, 2015. It was supposed to be a day of celebration, another ceremony, another award, the Abel Prize, mathematics' highest honor. John and Alicia left the stage arm in arm, smiling like two people who had nothing left to prove. They had survived madness, silence, isolation, and doubt. They had built a life from ashes. At 86 and 82, they were finally fully at peace. They boarded a taxi at Newark Airport, bound for home. No security, no fanfare. Just an aging couple in love, side by side, quietly returning to the life they had built together from rubble. The New Jersey Turnpike, 4:30 p.m. The driver lost control. No one knows exactly what happened next. The highway. A miscalculation. A moment. The taxi spun, struck a guardrail, and flipped. Neither John nor Alicia were wearing seatbelts. They were ejected from the vehicle. They died instantly, together. Not in a hospital bed. Not in the solitude of madness. Not in the isolation of regret. But together, in motion, in peace, side by side as they had been in every storm. John died with the only person who had ever fully seen him. And Alicia died beside the only man she had ever refused to abandon. The world mourned. Headlines grieved. Mathematicians wept. But those who knew them best said something different. It was perfect. They left together. Neither had to face a world without the other. It wasn't a tragic ending. It was somehow the only ending that made sense. Because what more could they have possibly said? What more could they have given? Their lives, messy, brilliant, agonizing, extraordinary, had already spoken everything. Take a breath. Let it sink in. Two lives that refused to be ordinary, that refused to surrender. That proved love isn't just an emotion. It's a choice you make every single day. Even when the person you love can't tell what's real. Even when the world tells you to leave. Even when it would be easier to let go. But their story doesn't end in that taxi. Chapter 14. What genius really means. For most of history, genius has worn a specific mask. Measurable, calculable, worshipped from afar. High IQ, early achievement, effortless mastery. But John Nash shattered that image. Because his genius wasn't clean. It wasn't polite. It wasn't always visible. Sometimes it screamed. Sometimes it hid. Sometimes it begged to be believed, even as it betrayed him. What Nash proved is that true genius isn't in what you see, but in what you survive. It's not in the awards, but in the mornings you choose to get up anyway. Not in the clarity of your logic, but in your refusal to surrender when your own mind becomes the battlefield. He forced the world to rethink what it meant to be intelligent. He wasn't a gifted child on a magazine cover. He was a man who battled shadows, who questioned every reality, including his own, and still managed to contribute something no one else could. Think about it, we almost lost him. Not to the illness, but to invisibility. Because the world is quick to discard minds it doesn't understand. Quick to label, institutionalize, and forget. Had Nash not returned, had he not chosen to sit silently in those Princeton classrooms for years, would anyone have remembered? That's the cruel paradox. Brilliance and madness often look the same from the outside. Until results appear, we call it broken. After success, we call it visionary. But Nash lived in the in-between. He stood as a reminder that the space between genius and delusion isn't a line, it's a spectrum, and anyone can fall on it. Here's what hits hardest right now. Somewhere there's another Nash, sitting alone, fighting voices, creating theorems no one will see, being called too much or too strange or too difficult. And the world is missing out. Have you ever hidden a part of your mind because you were afraid the world would call it wrong? That's where Nash lived. And that's where many of us visit, whether we admit it or not. But here's the truth: genius doesn't need to be perfect. It doesn't need to be graceful. It doesn't even need to be recognized in its own time. What it needs, what it demands, is the courage to keep thinking, to keep feeling, to keep going, even when the map disappears. Because in the end, Nash's greatest achievement wasn't the Nash equilibrium. It wasn't the Nobel Prize. It wasn't even his return to Princeton. It was this: he proved that you can lose your mind and still keep your value. You don't have to be normal. You just have to come back. Chapter 15. The Final Equation. What do we make of a life like John Nash's? A man who touched the peaks of human intellect and the depths of mental collapse, whose mind was both a cathedral and a cage. Some will say his legacy is game theory, that he gave us a new lens to view strategy, cooperation, and competition, and they wouldn't be wrong. But look deeper. His real legacy wasn't in formulas, it was in the spaces between them. He taught us that recovery is not a moment, it's a discipline. That brilliance isn't about being right, it's about continuing when everything in you says to quit. That love isn't found in perfection, but in showing up, over and over when it would be easier to disappear. His life is a mirror, for the parts of ourselves we try to silence, for the gifts we second-guess, for the voices we're ashamed to admit live inside us. Nash never became normal, he became whole. Not by silencing the chaos, but by learning which voices deserved his attention, which truths to hold, and which illusions to gently let pass. There's a scene many remember from A Beautiful Mind. An interviewer asks Nash how he's managed to live with his delusions for so long. He pauses and says, "I still see things that aren't there. I just choose not to acknowledge them. Like a diet of the mind. I just don't indulge certain appetites, that's it. That's the equation, the one no one taught us in school. Not how to erase pain, but how to live alongside it. Not how to silence madness, but how to disarm it. Not how to fit in, but how to return, quietly, powerfully, again and again, to the part of you that remains." So if you're still carrying chaos in your mind, if you've ever wondered whether your difference is your defect, remember Nash. He didn't wait to be healed to make a contribution, he made one anyway. And maybe that's what genius really is. Not the brightness of your mind, but the resilience of your spirit. Let me ask you something. What would you create if you stopped waiting to be fixed? What equation would you solve if you accepted yourself exactly as you are? The world is waiting for your answer. Not when you're perfect. Now. You are not alone in the dark. If you've made it this far, you already know. This wasn't just a biography. It was a reflection. A deep look into what happens when the mind bends, when reality blurs, and when genius walks a tightrope above madness. But more than that, this was a love story. A story about devotion, discipline, and the quiet bravery of choosing to come back to life, one breath at a time. So now I want to speak to you. Have you ever felt like your thoughts move too fast or too far from the world? Have you ever wondered if your brilliance is just a mask for something darker, something unnameable? Have you ever been told you're too intense, too strange, too much? Then maybe you're not broken. Maybe you're just John Nash in the middle of your own unwritten chapter. And maybe what you need isn't to fix yourself, but to stay, to observe, to keep showing up, even when the voices come, even when no one believes you, even when your story doesn't make sense yet. Because the world needs minds like yours, not when you're perfect, but when you're real. So here's what I want you to do, right now. 1. Comment below "I see the mirror." Let it be your way of saying, "I've been there. I get it. I'm still here." 2. If you know someone quietly battling their own ghosts, share this with them. Not for the facts, but for the feeling. Let this story be a lighthouse, a reminder that even the most brilliant minds can crack and still come back stronger. 3. Subscribe, not because of the algorithm, but because these are the stories we're telling, not of perfection, but of return. And ask yourself this: what would you create if you stopped waiting to be normal? What truth would you share if you knew someone somewhere needed to hear it? Because remember, genius isn't about never falling. It's about choosing over and over again to rise even when no one sees you. The world needs your equation. Start solving it today.